Hi, I'm Franz Newland from York University in Toronto, and I've very kindly been given the opportunity to speak to you by Jesse to tell you a little bit about how trade studies get run in the real world. So I am a space engineer. I have worked in the space industry for many years, and now I teach space engineering at York University here in Canada. So what are trade studies? They are generally used in many ways to support people who need to make difficult decisions. They allow you to compare things in an objective way. That's a way that avoids you having to think about emotional or other personal aspects. You can do it in a more abstract way, in a way that avoids you having to think about your personal reasons for doing something. And it also allows you to think about how to capture the process of making your decisions, so that if you are basing your decision on certain assumptions or criteria that may not be true in the future, you can always go back and reevaluate your decision by just changing those assumptions and seeing where it gets you next. So when you're thinking about doing a trade study, the first thing is worth thinking about is, what does it mean to be successful in doing a trade study? What is a good outcome if you've had your trade study and you get an answer? And why are you doing a trade study? It's not worth doing it just because you can. There needs to be a rationale as to why doing a trade study is a useful thing to do for the problem that you're facing, the decision that you're trying to make. And so when we think about the trade study process, we often think about the following steps, and we'll break it up into two phases. The first thing we're going to do is think about the objectives of the trade study. What are we trying to achieve by doing it? What are the needs that we're comparing? So we have options available to us. Those options have to fulfill certain needs. What are the needs and constraints that we have to operate within when making a decision? And what assumptions are we going to build our trade study on? What are we going to assume is correct or false or necessary in order to pin down what it is we're looking at? The next thing we need to do is think about how we're going to compare our different options. What are the criteria that matter when we're comparing things? And we'll look at that in more detail in a minute. Then we need to think about at what point in those criteria does it make no difference between different options? So below a certain value, it might be that all options are equal. Above a certain value, it might be there's no extra benefit to be had from improving a certain criteria. And then we need to think about what's the relative importance of each of these criteria we've used. Okay, and we'll look at these in a little bit more detail in a minute. Once we've done this, we can actually start doing our analysis of our options, but we can do all of this work before we've even looked at what are the possible ways that we could achieve our objectives. So once we have our criteria, our thresholds, and our relative weights, then we can go out and identify what are the different ways that we could solve our problem or meet our objectives. We can then assess the performance of each of those alternatives against each of the criteria. And then using the thresholds and the weights, we can actually compare how each is done. And then we can document the process. And when we compare and document, it's worth seeing how sensitive our answers are to the assumptions that we've made or the specific thresholds or weights we've applied. So let's consider an example. Here's a decision matrix for deciding which launch provider to use for a certain mission. And let's consider the criteria for launch of the cost of launching, the time it's going to take from now to get to a launch vehicle that's ready to launch us, the risk of a launch failure based on the number of successful launches that particular launch provider might have had before, and any political sensitivity. If we're thinking about launching from a country that may have some security issues or may not be friendly to our interests. So those could be our 4 criteria. And then for each of those criteria, we will define a threshold, we will define the relative importance of each, and we'll define a scale on which we're going to judge these. So it might be that the relevant risk that we're carrying at the minute suggests that the most important criterion is time to launch. We need a launch vehicle that's going to be ready quickly. Cost is generally a very critical factor when it comes to launch vehicles, so that might be our second most important criterion, and the other two might carry an equal weighting. And when it comes to time to launch, it might be that we have a minimum threshold. Anything less than 2 months makes no difference. If it's more than 2 months, that's when we start seeing some sensitivity around our launch options. You'll notice that the scale we're using for this first decision matrix is actually a very simple 1 to 3, worst to best. The reason for doing this is that early on when we're doing a decision matrix, we may not actually have specific numbers that we can use, but we might be able to rank our answers. And so we can use trade studies, and in particular decision matrices, even when we don't have very detailed information to base our trade study on. As long as we're able to do relative assessment of different options, that might be sufficient to get at least a first assessment of which is the right option for us. So if we then consider 3 options, at this point we've defined our criteria, thresholds, weights, and scales, so we can now actually apply our option information for those criteria. If we consider a launch from the Indian Space Research Organization, from a US launch provider, and from a Russian launch provider, we have our 3 different options that we're going to consider. And we might say that cost-wise, the ISRO launch is the best. The US comes in second. If it's one of our private launch options, it may still come in ahead of the Russian cost, and maybe the Russians are the most expensive. In terms of time to launch, the best may be option 2, the US launch, but the ISRO launch may come in second, and the Russians might be the slowest. In terms of the risk of a launch issue, the Russians are always the best in this criteria because they've had the largest number of successful launches. ISRO now have had a good number of launches, and if we're dealing with a private US launch vehicle, maybe they haven't had so many launches already, so they come in bottom in that criterion. And finally, if we look at political sensitivity, there are issues with export to Russia for sure, potentially to the US at the minute with political uncertainties between US and Canada on trade. And maybe ISRO, India is perhaps a friendly partner. Maybe we want to build a relationship with India at the moment. And so we can we can scale our different answers, and then we use the weighting that we predefined to determine which is the best. Now, what we find, if we look at this, is the Russian launch actually doesn't meet one of our criteria. So based on our minimum criterion, it might be, or maximum criterion, it might be that we can exclude one of our options before we even do our trade. And then when we take our weighted value for the other 2, we come up with a preferred solution. So it's worth noting that when we make decisions using decision matrices, that we have to do it very often with imperfect information. We're doing our best work with what we have. We need to have confidence in our solution, but we don't need to have more than that, okay? If the decision doesn't feel right, where we've done it in a way where we've tried to remove that emotion, it's worth exploring that emotion when we come up with a solution. So if the decision doesn't feel right, it's worth exploring, why do we feel it's not right? And that might then come back to looking at, did we assign the weights correctly? Did we assign our thresholds correctly? And that's where we can explore those aspects in our sensitivity analysis. Doesn't mean the answer is wrong. It means it's worth exploring whether we set the right criteria or whether we're sensitive to the criteria that we think actually might matter more than we said they did when we defined them abstractly. And the final one is worth thinking that whilst we're getting numerical results out, which suggest a certain accuracy, it looks like option 1 is 78% good and option 2 is 73% good. These are subjective rankings. The numerical data are based on our subjective rankings of scale, our subjective choice of weights, and our subjective definition of thresholds. So those numerical values are still a subjective ranking, even though it appears they have a certain level of objective accuracy to them. They're just better than had we done it purely subjectively with no method to improve that process. Now, having got a trade analysis done through this method, it's worth also looking at some other ways that we can do a trade analysis. So trade trees is one way that we can do it. This allows us to capture all the different alternatives that might be available, that allows us to consider which options we're going to compare using a trade. So let's consider all the options available if we wanted to develop a mission heading to Mars, for example. We can consider human exploration of Mars as our goal. And when we consider the different ways that we can get there, it might be that there's two primary options. One is to have a long-term stay on Mars. It's actually difficult to time trajectories to get to Mars. So there are options where you go for a long period of time. And there are others where we could consider a very short round trip, where we have a short visit on Mars. So if we take those two as our baseline options, it might then be that we can consider how to achieve a human mission to Mars might require, again, two possible options. We might have pre-deployed materials sent to Mars in advance of the human mission, or missions where we have to send everything along with the crew that's going to go. Both of these options could be considered for either of the first two mission types. And so as we add different stages to our mission, we can start building a large number of options. So with just 5 different levels of choice, each one with 2 possible opportunities or 3 possible opportunities, we can rapidly end up with 48 different possible scenarios to consider. If we were to try to perform a trade tree on all 48, this would take us a long time to actually perform a useful trade study. Comparing 48 different options becomes rather excessive. So instead of considering all 48 options, what we can actually do is look at example options to cover the whole of the trade tree space. So for example, let's consider a mission where we plan to have a long stay on Mars. We do plan to pre-deploy some materials to allow us to reduce the weight that's required when we fly the crew to Mars. We're going to consider an approach to Mars that requires a propulsion system rather than relying on the drag that the Mars atmosphere gives us. We're not going to rely on in situ resources to escape from Mars at the end of the stay on Mars. And our propulsion systems we're going to use will assume chemical propulsion. This is one path through our full trade tree. Using this, we could take this as one option that we're going to then trade against one significantly different option that might not have any pre-deployment, that might use aero capture, that might not use chemical propulsion, might use electrical propulsion, and that maybe relies on some degree of in situ resources to fuel that electrical system. So to conclude, trade studies can help us in making decisions, and trade trees can help us work out which combination of decisions we want to consider in a formal trade study. Trade studies and trade trees are used in real-world complex questions and space mission, for example. And you can already use them for any complex decisions you have to make today. So hopefully that was a useful introduction to trade studies and how you might be able to implement them in your own work and things that you have to decide every day. Thank you.